All women are different, but they are all women. This video is androcentric from a men's point of view and is presented as opinion, commentary, and debate. Expressing opinions is not violence. These are ideas to challenge, question, and argue in public, because classical liberalism relies on the First Amendment for its dialectic. If you are a feminist, then consider this. If patriarchy truly existed as claimed, feminism could not. And if all men are trash and women are equal to men, then what are we to conclude? Women will die for their children. Men will die for their wives and children, and God chose to die for all mankind. Authority rolls up with responsibility. If this framing of facts offends you, click off to a cute cat video. Proceeding further will expose you to gamma bias and criticism directed at ideas, claims, institutions, not at any individual's virtue or dignity. Our method follows the 7 liberal arts, the trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, and the transcendentals, the good, true, and beautiful. If this framework is not for you, feel free to exit now. It's no disgrace. Women are wonderful. God bless America. Men are great. Feminismus delendus est. 16-bit fun. It's all you need, written by Conrad Riker. Available now. Links in description. Retro gaming history. A red-pilled map for the argument nobody wants to have. I sat in room 4B of the Municipal Family Policy Committee while Dr. Alara Vance, tenured, tremulous, trembling with the ecstasy of the aggrieved, presided over what she called the Fatherhood Equity Initiative. The agenda was simple. Redefine a father's provision not as duty honored, not as sacrifice made flesh, not as the ancient masculine offering laid on the household altar, but as unearned masculine privilege subject to a new corrective tax. The committee voted 4-1. When Conrad Riker, a man who had spent 20 years studying the disciplined resource economies of 16-bit gaming, where every pixel of provision was earned through constrained, skillful play, stood and argued that fatherhood is the Aristotelian virtue of provision through constraint, Vance dismissed his techno-nostalgia as hegemonic narrative control. His male gaze on the budget, she said, was an act of violence. The meeting ended. The rainbow on the wall poster behind her, once a sign of God's promise to restrain judgment after the flood, had become a prism of fluid identity, dissolving every hard line of duty into the soft, wet chaos of appetite. It looked compassionate. It always looks compassionate. That is the first tell of the demonic. It enters wearing the face of mercy. The committee believed it was protecting dependents, honoring emotional labor, correcting historical injustice. The language was polished, moral, soaked in the vocabulary of care. But beneath the surgical clean terminology, a machinery of extraction was being installed. The father would carry the entire financial burden of the household while being stripped of every corresponding authority. His competence was taxed as surplus theft. His guidance was recoded as oppression. His restraint was called rigidity. The initiative did not abolish paternal responsibility, it weaponized it. It demanded the fruit of fatherhood while severing the root. This is what ideology does. It takes the language of love and builds a toll booth on the bridge between a man and his children. Psychoanalysis exposes the mechanism instantly. The ideology cannot tolerate the father's authority because authority implies a standard, and standards imply judgment, and judgment implies that someone is failing. The narcissistic wound of failure is so unbearable to the modern therapeutic consciousness that it must abolish the measuring stick rather than rise to it. So the standard itself is pathologized. Provision becomes extraction. Discipline becomes trauma. Beauty becomes exclusion. Merit becomes privilege. Every faculty that allows a civilization to say better and worse is reclassified as violence. This is not compassion. Compassion without correction is disguised contempt. What looks like mercy is actually the resentment of the incompetent organized into policy, a vast coordinated attack on the right of reality to answer back. And here is the contradiction that collapses the entire structure under the weight of its own internal logic. They demand the abolition of paternal authority to end oppression, while simultaneously demanding the full financial burden of paternal duty to ensure survival. Authority without sacrifice is tyranny. Duty without authority is servitude. A father taxed for his competence, stripped of his voice, and commanded to fund the institution that dispossessed him is not a citizen. He is a beast of burden hitched to a cart that runs over his children. Justice is giving each his due. What they call justice is taking from one to give to another and calling the theft a sacrament. The bill comes due regardless of the name on the check. Reality answers back. It always does. Scenario. In a mid-sized municipal family policy committee meeting, Dr. Elara Vance, a tenured sociologist with a tenure-track pedigree, presides over the Fatherhood Equity Initiative. The agenda item redefined paternal responsibility not as active provision or moral guidance, but as financial extraction to offset systemic patriarchal surplus. The committee votes 4-1 to implement a new tax bracket for single-income households, where the husband earns more than the wife, labeling the surplus unearned masculine privilege. When Conrad Reicher, a 16-bit era gaming historian and traditionalist, argues that fatherhood requires the Aristotelian virtue of provision through constraint, citing the SNES era's disciplined resource management, Vance dismisses his techno-nostalgia as hegemonic narrative control. She demands Reicher accept that his male gaze on the budget is an act of violence against the lived reality of the dependents. The meeting concludes with the ratification of a policy that taxes the father's competence to subsidize the mother's emotional labor, while simultaneously declaring the father's authority oppressive, because it is unilateral. The symbol of the rainbow covenant is inverted. The rainbow is no longer a sign of divine restraint after the flood, but a prism of fluid identity that dissolves the hard lines of duty, leaving only the soft, wet chaos of appetite. Scenario title: The Bayreuth Budget, Taxing the Logos, Core Contradiction. The ideology demands the abolition of paternal authority to end oppression, while simultaneously demanding the full financial burden of the family to ensure survival, creating a sovereign debt trap where the father is stripped of command but retains the liability. Satanic inversion. The good of fatherhood, provision, protection, discipline, is inverted into bad oppression, extraction, rigidity. The bad of dependency, neediness, lack of discipline, is inverted into good authenticity, liberation, fluidity. The rainbow, a sign of God's promise to limit judgment, becomes a symbol of unlimited appetite and the dissolution of boundaries. Matrix of sins. Pride, the refusal to accept the father's role as a gift of service, recoding it as a theft of power. The committee believes it can redesign the family without reference to natural law. Envy, resentment of the father's competence and the stability he provides. The surplus is not seen as reward for virtue, but as stolen goods. Wrath, the activist rage against patriarchy, is used to justify punitive taxation and the erasure of paternal voice in the home. Sloth acedia, the refusal of the hard yoke of traditional duty. The mother's emotional labor is elevated to transcend the physical labor of provision, allowing for a leisure class existence subsidized by the father. Lust, gluttony. The appetite for fluidity and inclusion becomes a gluttony for status and resources, without the corresponding virtue of restraint. Avarice, the institutional capture of the family unit to extract wealth from the competent men to redistribute to the institution, state, HR, and the dependent, wife, children. Vainglory, the performance of equity in the committee meeting where the language is polished and moral, but the outcome is purely extractive. Despair, the belief that the traditional family is irredeemably broken, so it must be dismantled and rebuilt from the bottom up, ignoring the wisdom of the great books of social structure. Scenario map. Scenario: the Bayreuth Budget. In a municipal family policy committee, Dr. Elara Vance chairs the Fatherhood Equity Initiative. The agenda redefines paternal responsibility as financial extraction to offset systemic patriarchal surplus. A new tax is imposed on single-income households where the husband earns more, when Conrad Reicher argues fatherhood requires Aristotelian provision through constraint. Vance dismisses this as techno-nostalgia and hegemonic narrative control. The policy taxes fatherly competence to subsidize maternal emotional labor, while declaring paternal authority oppressive. Ideology: a fusion of feminist standpoint epistemology, critical family theory, and cultural Marxism. It treats paternal authority as oppression, demands state redistribution to equalize outcomes, and reframes male competence as unearned privilege requiring punitive taxation. Core contradiction. The ideology demands abolition of paternal authority to end oppression, while simultaneously demanding the full financial burden of the family to ensure survival. This creates a sovereign debt trap. The father is stripped of command but retains liability. Sin matrix, pride chiefly named. Pride, refusal to accept fatherhood as a gift of service, recoding it as theft of power. The committee believes it can redesign the family without reference to natural law. Envy, resentment of the father's competence and stability. Wrath, activist rage, used to justify punitive taxation. Sloth acedia, refusal of the hard yoke of traditional duty. Lust gluttony, appetite for fluidity as gluttony for status and resources. Avarice, institutional capture to extract wealth from the competent. Vainglory, performance of equity with extractive outcomes. Despair, belief that the traditional family is irredeemably broken. Genesis, covenant symbol inversion. The rainbow, originally God's covenant sign limiting judgment after the flood, is inverted into a symbol of unlimited appetite and dissolution of boundaries. The rainbow of fluid identity dissolves the hard lines of duty into soft, wet chaos. Satanic inversion. The good of fatherhood, provision, protection, discipline is inverted into bad, oppression, extraction, rigidity. The bad of dependency, neediness, lack of discipline is inverted into good, authenticity, liberation, fluidity. The rainbow becomes a symbol of unlimited appetite.
Dr. Winona's position. Dr. Winona argues that 16-bit masculine excellence, e.g. Super Mario World, is a metaphor for rigid patriarchy excluding women and children. She claims paternal authority is inherently destructive, father absent or villain. Taxation of surplus is restorative justice. Provision is colonial extraction.
Psychoanalytic and trait model axes. Adlerian will to power inequality language. Vance demands submission to her lived experience as ultimate truth. Fallacy, appeal to emotion ad hominem. Androcentric decode, her liberation is ascension to unearned authority. Counter, equality is fair application of standards. Jungian shadow of the father. Committee projects its incompetence onto the father figure. Fallacy, projection straw man. Decode, they fear your competence as mirror. Counter, father is light revealing shadow. Freudian reaction formation, hatred of paternal authority expressed as excessive care for child's emotional needs. Fallacy, category error, emotion versus labor. Decode, they love power to define reality. Counter, true love says no. Big Five, low conscientiousness moralized, low diligence reframed as resistance to oppressive standards. Fallacy, reframing equivocation. Decode, they call discipline rigidity because their laziness feels freedom. Counter, standards are walls that keep the storm out. Attachment, anxious, preoccupied inversion. Demand for constant validation disguised as right. Fallacy, begging the question, trauma exists to justify payment. Decode, they seek a mother who never says no. Counter, security from structure. Attribution error of structural guilt. Individual success attributed to systemic oppression. Failure to systemic oppression. Fallacy, fundamental attribution error. Double standard. Decode, your virtue is theft. Counter, judge the act, not the identity. Moral psychology fairness as symmetry. Confusion of equality with equity. Fallacy, equivocation. Justice equals redistribution. Decode, they want benefits without costs. Counter, justice is giving each their due. Postmodern fallacy of language games, belief that changing the name changes reality. Fallacy, nominalism, linguistic determinism. Decode, word games hide material dependency. Counter, reality answers back.
Dr. Winona's demonstration.
Toward a liberatory architecture of familial equity, restorative justice, and the decommodification of paternal surplus. By Dr. Winona Ryland Okafor, Ph.D., Institute for Relational Justice and Applied Equity Studies. A prefatory note on method and care. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that this work emerges from a place of deep commitment to care, not the sentimental, depoliticized care that hegemonic institutions have historically weaponized to silence critique, but structural care, the deliberate evidence-informed practice of redistributing resources toward those whose lived realities have been marginalized by centuries of patriarchal encoding. I say this because I know that the very act of naming structural harm produces discomfort in those who have benefited from its invisibility. I want to be clear, discomfort is not harm. Your discomfort is data. It tells us where the work needs to happen. The so-called standard, a genealogy of extraction. We are often told by figures like Mr. Conrad Riker, who recently graced our committee with what I can only describe as a tour de force of techno-nostalgic mystification, that there exists a standard of fatherhood rooted in something he calls provision through constraint. He cites with breathless reverence the resource management mechanics of 16-bit video games as a metaphor for masculine excellence. I want to sit with that for a moment. What Mr. Riker is doing, and what the entire traditionalist architecture does, is naturalizing a historically specific mode of domination by dressing it in the language of virtue. The word provision comes from the Latin providere, to see ahead. But what does the patriarchal father see ahead? He sees his own legacy. He sees a world ordered to his name carried forward by children whom he has shaped in his image, through what Riker, with stunning transparency, calls constraint. Constraint, let us hold that word. It means drawing tightly together. It means binding. It means the compression of possibility into a form that serves the one who binds. This is not virtue. This is extraction disguised as love. 3. The competence frame, or how merit conceals power. The most insidious rhetorical move in the traditionalist playbook is the framing of differential outcomes as deserved reward. The father earns more. Why? Because he is more competent, because he worked harder, because he embraced discipline. We must reject this framing root and branch. What we call competence in the single income male earner is in every measurable sense a product of systemic scaffolding, the gendered wage gap that historically privileged male labor, the social capital of masculine networks, the expectation that women would perform uncompensated reproductive and emotional labor to stabilize the domestic environment in which that competence could flourish. Mr. Riker calls his success earned. I ask, earned by whom? Alone. The answer is never alone. The answer is always together. But the patriarchal ledger only records one name. When we propose a modest corrective taxation of the single income surplus, what we precisely and deliberately term unearned masculine privilege, we are not punishing the father. We are making visible the invisible labor that produced his surplus. We are capacifying the dependents, restoring to them the agency that was structurally subtracted from them by the very arrangement that produced his excellence. To call this theft is to reveal that you believe the surplus was yours to begin with. It never was. A V on discipline and the trauma of standards. One of the most emotionally charged moments in our committee meeting came when Mr. Riker invoked the Aristotelian virtue of provision through constraint. He spoke of the SNES era's rigid, skill-based mechanics as though they were a sacred pedagogy. You had to earn the level, he said. You had to fail and try again. I felt the room shift. There was something almost liturgical in his cadence, and that is precisely the problem. What Riker is actually describing, and what he cannot see, because he is inside the architecture, is a trauma model of personhood. The child and the father as form child is told, you are not enough as you are. You must be compressed. You must be constrained. You must suffer the repeated failure of the level until you conform to its rigid demands. And when you finally succeed, you are told, see, the constraint made you be grateful. This is not pedagogy. This is the internalization of harm as identity. The word standard comes from Old French estendard, a rallying flag in battle. A standard is not neutral, it is a battle standard. It marks a territory taken. When Riker says standards, he means his territory. He means the world that looks like him. Our work is to lower, not the aspiration, never the aspiration, but the weaponization of the standard. To say you do not need to be conformed to a rigid, historically patriarchal form to be worthy. Your lived experience is not a deviation from a norm. It is a reality that the norm has failed to see. V. The rainbow and the refusal of hard lines. I want to address briefly the symbolic anxiety that some have expressed regarding our use of rainbow imagery in the initiative's materials. The rainbow is, in the Genesis narrative, a covenant of restraint. God promises never again to destroy, but notice what is restrained. It is judgment. The rainbow is God's limit on his own power to condemn. We take that symbol and we extend it. The rainbow becomes not merely a sign that judgment will be limited, but that identity itself is fluid, that the hard lines of patriarchal role, father as paviter, mother as dependent, are not natural law, but historical choices that can be unchosen. This is not inversion. This is fulfillment. The rainbow was always a promise that the old order of flood and destruction would end. We are keeping that promise. Those who cling to the hard lines of duty are clinging to the flood, not the covenant. Vi. On the charge of sovereign debt. Our critics, Riker chief among them, argue that we are creating a sovereign debt trap, stripping the father of authority while retaining his financial liability. He calls this servitude without sovereignty. This is a category error born of proprietary thinking. The father's financial contribution is not a tax on his sovereignty. It is a recognition of his relational obligation. The word obligation comes from Latin obligare, to bind toward. The father is bound toward his dependents, not as their ruler, but as their partner in justice. Authority, in the patriarchal frame, means the right to decide how resources are allocated. We are not removing that right, we are democratizing it. The dependents, the partner, the children, have a claim on the distribution of resources that is equal in dignity to the earner's claim. To call this theft of authority is to reveal that you believe earning confers ownership, and that ownership confers sovereignty. The household is not a kingdom, it is a commons. VIA, the lived experience imperative. Mr. Riker brought data. He brought historical analysis of game mechanics. He brought citations. We brought lives. I want to be absolutely clear about this. Lived experience is not anecdote. It is the primary epistemic ground from which all structural analysis must proceed. When a dependent partner says, "I feel erased by the current arrangement," that is not a feeling to be managed. It is a testimony to be honored. The patriarchal epistemology demands that data override testimony. We insist that testimony is data. It is the data that matters most, because it is the data of suffering. When Riker dismissed Dr. Vance's reference to lived reality as appeal to emotion, he was performing the very hegemonic move we exist to dismantle, the delegitimization of subjugated knowledge. Your metrics are not neutral. They are built in the image of the people who built them. Fert on toxic leftism and the rhetoric of demonic possession. I am aware that our work has been characterized by elements of what I will graciously call the counter-reformational masculinity sphere, as demonic, cancerous, ideologically possessed. We are told we are NPCs, zombies, tools of a satanic hydra. I will not return this rhetoric. I will simply note that every liberation movement in history has been described by the order it challenged as possessed, diseased, unnatural. The abolitionists were called agents of disorder. The suffragists were called hysterical. We are called ideologically possessed. The word possession implies the loss of selfhood to an alien force. I invite you to consider who in this scenario is reciting inherited formulas, who is channeling the voice of Aristotle, of Genesis, of natural law, who is performing the script of a tradition without examining its foundations. We are not the ones who are possessed. IX. Concluding reflection toward a compassionate architecture. What we are building slowly, imperfectly, with deep care is a world in which no one's humanity is contingent on their conformity to a patriarchal standard of excellence. A world in which emotional labor is visible labor. A world in which provision is shared, not wielded. A world in which the rainbow means what it has always meant, the end of the old order of flood. We are not destroying civilization. We are refusing the fiction that civilization requires a throne. The father's role is not to rule. The father's role is to participate in care, in provision, in the co-construction of a household that honors every member's full, fluid, unbounded humanity. Anything less is not tradition. It is control, and we are done with it. Dr. Winona Ryland Okafor is director of the Institute for Relational Justice and Applied Equity Studies. Her most recent book is Toward a Post-Paternal Epistemology, Care, Critique, and the Architecture of Liberation, Oberlin Press, 2023. Psychoanalytic Debunk. Why Your Competence is Their Crime. The Beirut Tax on the Logos. The scenario. Picture the room, a mid-sized municipal building somewhere in the long gray twilight of the managerial state. Fluorescent lights, bad coffee. A whiteboard on which the death of the family is being flow-charted with cheerful colors. Dr. Elara Vance presides. She chairs the Fatherhood Equity Initiative, a committee whose name performs the linguistic sleight-of-hand characteristic of all ideological capture operations. The word fatherhood signals warmth. The word equity signals extraction. The combination tells you exactly what is coming. The father will be honored to death. The agenda item reads like a ransom note written by a sociology department. Redefine paternal responsibility, not as active provision, moral formation, sacrifice, or disciplined love, but as financial extraction to offset systemic patriarchal surplus. The proposed mechanism is a new tax bracket imposed on single-income households where the husband earns more than the wife. The earnings gap is labeled unearned masculine privilege. The revenue is redirected to subsidize the mother's emotional labor. Simultaneously, the committee declares the father's authority oppressive because it is unilateral. This is what we might call, borrowing from the dictionary's forgotten basement, the Baruth maneuver, a governmental shell game in which the house always wins and the tenant always pays. You are charged rent on the property you built, then evicted for objecting. Enter Conrad Riker. He is a man who remembers what standards felt like before they were reclassified as violence. He argues that fatherhood requires what Aristotle called provision through constraint, the disciplined channeling of male energy toward protection, formation, and the transmission of inheritance. He cites the 16-bit era's rigid, skill-based mechanics as a metaphor. You had to earn the level. You had to fail, adapt, persist, and overcome. The standard was the ladder. The friction was the point. Vance dismisses this as techno-nostalgia and hegemonic narrative control. She demands that Riker accept his male gaze on the budget is itself an act of violence against the lived reality of the dependents. The committee votes 4-1. The policy passes. The competent man is taxed to subsidize the dependencies that his competence makes possible, while his authority over those dependencies is declared illegitimate. The rainbow, once a covenant sign of divine restraint after judgment, a promise that the waters of chaos would not again consume the earth, is inverted. It now adorns the committee's letterhead as a prism of fluid identity, dissolving the hard lines of duty, sex, office, and nature into the soft, wet chaos of unconstrained appetite. The covenant bow aimed at heaven is turned sideways, a horizontal refusal of all vertical order. Here is the core contradiction, stated with surgical clarity. The ideology demands the abolition of paternal authority to end oppression, while simultaneously demanding the full financial burden of the family to ensure survival. The father is stripped of command but retains all liability. He is the beast of burden for a cart he is not permitted to steer. This is not equity. This is the sovereign debt trap, a man indentured to a household whose governance has been outsourced to a committee of strangers, and the resentful feelings of people who have never built anything. Dr. Winona Ryland Okafor, director of the Fictional Institute for Relational Justice and Applied Equity Studies, publishes a defense of this policy. Her essay is a tour de force of exactly the rhetorical pattern we are about to dissect. It is compassionate in tone, extractive in substance, and self-refuting in structure. It performs, with breathtaking precision, the very thing it claims to cure. Let us take it apart, screw by screw, like mechanics dismantling an engine that was installed backwards. The compassion mask. Dr. Winona begins with what every ideological conqueror begins with: the compassion mask. I want to acknowledge that this work emerges from a place of deep commitment to care. Translation: I am about to rob you and I need you to feel grateful. The compassion mask is the oldest trick in the tyrant's wardrobe. It works by front-loading moral language so that any objection to the policy can be reframed as an objection to the morality. If you resist the tax, you resist care. If you resist care, you are cruel. If you are cruel, you are the problem the policy was designed to solve. The circle closes, the trap springs. Note the etymological sleight of hand. Care comes from Old English siru, sorrow, anxiety, burden. To care is to bear weight, but Winona's structural care bears no weight, it redistributes weight. It takes the burden off the dependent and places it on the competent, then calls the transfer justice. The father who actually bears the weight through labor, sacrifice, provision, protection is told his burden is unearned privilege. The committee that votes to transfer his wages to someone else calls itself the one who cares. This is not care. This is the cosmetic application of empathy language to an extraction racket. Winona then deploys the central weapon of the compassion mask. Discomfort is not harm. Your discomfort is data. This is a Kafka trap. It is designed to make resistance confirm the diagnosis. If you agree, you agree. If you disagree, your disagreement is evidence of the problem. Your acquiescence and your rebellion both produce the same verdict. You are guilty. The only way to win is to confess your privilege and submit to the policy. Real compassion says, I see you struggling. Here is the standard. Here is the ladder. I will help you climb. Winona's compassion says, I see you struggling. The ladder is oppressive. I will burn it, tax the man who built it, and call the ashes liberation. The maxim holds, compassion without correction is disguised contempt, and contempt dressed in a lab coat is still contempt. The unconscious payoff. Before we open the psychoanalytic toolbox, let us ask the question Winona's essay never asks, cui bono? Who benefits? The father loses wages and authority. The mother gains subsidies but loses the complementary partner whose competence made the household possible. The children lose the structured formation that a father's discipline provides, replaced by a committee's lived experience certifications. The taxpayer picks up the administrative overhead. The public trust erodes as institutions reveal themselves to be extraction engines with mission statements. But Dr. Vance gains power. The committee gains jurisdiction. The institute gains funding. The activist class gains status. Dr. Winona gains a book contract, a speaking circuit, and the warm glow of moral superiority that comes from managing other people's money in the name of justice. This is the unconscious payoff. The ideology does not fail by its own lights, it succeeds. Its purpose is not to liberate the dependent, but to empower the manager. Every equity initiative creates a new class of overseers whose salaries depend on the persistence of the grievance they are paid to address. The grievance is the product. The dependent is the customer. The competent man is the raw material. The committee is the factory. Winona's essay is the factory's press release. Consider the word capacifying. Winona invents it or borrows it from the jargon minds of critical theory to describe what the policy does for dependents. It restores agency, but the word means the opposite of what it claims. To capacify someone is to make them a patient, not an agent. You do not build agency by handing someone a check extracted from their neighbor. You build agency by giving them a standard, a skill, a craft, and the freedom to fail until they succeed. You build agency by treating them as competent, not as traumatized. The unconscious payoff is that the ideology manufactures the very helplessness it claims to cure, then charges the cure to the man whose competence it resents. It is a perpetual motion machine of grievance, powered by envy, maintained by bureaucracy, and lubricated with the language of care. The psychoanalytic axes. Now we open the case. 8 lenses, 8 cuts. Each one reveals a different fracture line in the ideology's architecture. Axis I, the Adlerian will to power in equality language. Alfred Adler understood that the drive to overcome feelings of inferiority is the engine of human ambition. When this drive is sublimated into craft, service, and mastery, it produces excellence. When it is moralized, when the inferiority complex is dressed as virtue and weaponized against the competent, it produces the pattern we see in Dr. Vance. Vance sits at the head of a committee that has the power to tax, redefine, and regulate the family. She has achieved this position not through the apprenticeship ladder of competence, building something, fixing something, protecting something, but through the institutional ladder of credentialism, activism, and ideological conformity. She holds authority she did not earn through service. She exercises power she cannot justify through craft. Her inferiority, the nagging suspicion that she has never built anything that stands on its own, is overcome not by becoming competent, but by redefining competence as oppression. Her demand that Riker submit to her lived experience as ultimate truth is the Adlerian will to power in its purest form. She cannot defeat his argument, so she disqualifies the arguer. She cannot meet his standard, so she abolishes the standard. Her liberation is her ascension to a position of unearned authority over the very men whose competence exposes her insufficiency. Winona's essay performs the same maneuver. She calls Riker's competence systemic scaffolding, a product of gendered wage gaps and masculine networks. She cannot acknowledge that Riker earned what he has because his earned success indicts her unearned authority. So she reframes his effort as theft and her extraction as restitution. Androcentric decode. Her liberation is not your freedom, it is her rule. Counter-logos, equality is not the abolition of hierarchy, but the fair application of standards to all. Judge the act, not the identity. Judge the fruit, not the intention. Axis 2. The Jungian shadow of the father. Carl Jung described the shadow as the disowned parts of the psyche, the traits, impulses, and failures a person refuses to acknowledge in themselves and therefore projects onto others. The committee's characterization of the father as oppressive, extractive, and rigid is textbook shadow projection. The father's discipline is called control, his provision is called extraction. His authority is called violence. These are not descriptions of the father. They are confessions of the committee. The committee members, Vance, Winona, the anonymous four who voted for the policy, look at the father and see their own unacknowledged hunger for power dressed in his clothes. They call him controlling because they wish to control. They call him extractive because they wish to extract. They call his discipline rigid because their own lack of discipline fills them with shame they cannot face. Winona's essay radiates this projection. She writes, "The patriarchal ledger only records one name, but Winona's ledger also records only one name, hers. Her ideology, her institute, her committee, her lived experience, her structural care, she erases the father's labor to inflate her own importance. She calls this making visible the invisible labor. But she is making invisible the visible labor of the man who actually pays the bills." Androcentric decode. They fear your competence because it is their mirror. Your strength exposes their weakness, so they must shatter the glass. Counter logos. The father is not the shadow, he is the light that reveals it. Axis 3. The Freudian reaction formation. Sigmund Freud described reaction formation as the transformation of an unacceptable impulse into its opposite. The person who feels rage dresses it as love. The person who feels hatred dresses it as care. Winona's essay is a masterclass in reaction formation. She writes about care, structural care, deep commitment to care, with the intensity of someone performing exorcism on her own impulses. Behind the care language is a fury so potent, it can barely be contained by jargon. The hatred of paternal authority, the raw, pulsing resentment of the man who can, who does, who builds, who provides, who disciplines, who says no, cannot be expressed directly in a civilized institution, so it is sublimated. It becomes excessive care for the child's emotional needs. It becomes protective concern for the marginalized. It becomes restorative justice for historical harms that no one in the room has suffered. Winona calls the father's provision colonial extraction from the domestic sphere. She compares his discipline to the internalization of harm as identity. She is not describing fatherhood. She is describing her own rage at the father projected outward, dressed in compassion and weaponized as policy. The tell is in the language's excess. Real care is quiet. It does not need press releases. Real love sets boundaries. It does not dissolve them. Real compassion corrects. It does not flatter. Winona's compassion is loud, boundary dissolving, and flatteringly endless. It is the exact shape of its opposite. Androcentric decode. They do not love the child. They love the power to define the child's reality and to punish the father who challenges their definition. Counter logos, true love, is disciplined. It says no to build character, not yes to validate appetite. A father who never says no is not loving. He is absent in the worst way. Axis IV, the Big Five low conscientiousness moralized. The Big Five trait model identifies conscientiousness, diligence, orderliness, self-discipline, achievement striving as one of the 5 major axes of personality. Low conscientiousness predicts poor academic performance, job instability, health problems, and financial insecurity. It is, in plain terms, the inability to do what you said you would do when you said you would do it to the standard you agreed to meet. The ideology's genius, or rather its cunning, is to reframe low conscientiousness as moral virtue. Winona writes that Riker's standards are a trauma model of personhood. She describes the 16-bit era's demand that the player earn the level as a form of compression and binding. She calls the standard a battle standard, a territorial marker, not a measuring stick. This is low conscientiousness moralized. The person who cannot meet the standard does not say, "I need to train harder." She says the standard is violence. She does not say, "I failed." She says the test failed me. She does not climb the ladder. She calls the ladder a wall and demands that someone demolish it, and then taxes the man who built the ladder to pay for the demolition. The consequences are devastating. When diligence is called rigidity, no one trains. When order is called oppression, no one builds. When punctuality is called violence, no one arrives on time, and the bridge collapses. The surgery goes wrong, the harvest rots, the child goes unformed. The word standard comes from Old French estandarte, a rallying flag. Winona is right that a standard marks territory. She is wrong about whose territory. A standard does not mark the competent man's territory. It marks reality's territory. It says, here's the line between what works and what doesn't, between what builds and what collapses, between what is and what isn't. Androcentric decode. They call your discipline rigidity because their laziness feels like freedom. But laziness is not freedom. It is the slow enslavement to decay. Counter logos. Standards are ladders. Resentment calls them walls. Lowering the measure does not lift the person. A civilization that cannot say better and worse cannot survive. Axis V. The attachment anxious preoccupied inversion. Attachment theory describes patterns of bonding formed in early childhood. The anxious preoccupied pattern is characterized by a chronic demand for reassurance, a fear of abandonment, and a tendency to treat other people's autonomy as a threat. The committee's policy is an attachment disorder legislated into law. The demand that the father pay endlessly, unconditionally, without authority over how the money is spent, is the demand of an anxious, preoccupied child who wants a parent who never says no. The committee does not want justice. It wants a cosmic mother, infinite, accommodating, unconditionally validating, and permanently available. Winona's essay encodes this demand perfectly. She calls for a world where no one's humanity is contingent on their conformity to a patriarchal standard of excellence. Translation: no one should ever be told they are failing. No one should ever face a standard they cannot meet. No one should ever experience the pain of falling short. But this is not compassion. This is the abolition of growth. A child who is never told no does not become free. He becomes a tyrant, a small screaming god who demands the universe rearrange itself around his feelings. The committee's policy produces exactly this. A population of adults with the emotional regulation of toddlers, funded by the labor of men who have mastered their impulses. The attachment inversion is the demand for security without structure, but security does not come from accommodation. It comes from predictability, from knowing where the walls are, what the rules are, and what happens when you break them. A father's authority is not a threat to a child's security. It is the foundation of it. Androcentric decode, they are not seeking justice. They are seeking a parent who will never say no, and they will tax you to fund the fantasy. Counter logos, security comes from structure, not from endless accommodation. A house with no walls is not a home, it is weather. Axis VIX, the attribution error of structural guilt. Attribution theory studies how people explain success and failure. The fundamental attribution error is the tendency to explain one's own failures as products of circumstance while explaining others' failures as products of character. The ideology operationalizes this error at civilizational scale. We known as SA performs it with textbook precision. Riker's success is unearned privilege, attributed to systemic scaffolding, gendered wage gaps, and masculine networks. His effort, discipline, sacrifice, and delayed gratification are erased. The dependent's failure is structural oppression attributed to patriarchal surplus, hegemonic narrative control, and historical erasure. Their choices, habits, and effort levels are erased. The committee's policy is structural wisdom, attributed to evidence-informed practice and restorative justice. Its extraction, coercion, and resentment are erased. This is not analysis. This is theft by epistemology. The ideology creates a causal framework in which every competent man's success is evidence of his guilt and every dependent's failure is evidence of his victimhood. The verdict is written before the evidence is examined. The trial is a formality. The double standard is total. If Riker earns more, it is because the system is rigged in his favor. If Vance earns a salary from taxing Riker, it is because the system is working toward justice. If the father provides, he is extracting. If the committee taxes, it is restoring. If a man disciplines his children, he is violent. If a committee redefines the family by fiat, it is inclusive. Androcentric decode. Your virtue is their theft. Their vice is your burden. You pay for their feelings. They take credit for your work. Counterlogos. Judge the act, not the identity. Judge the result, not the intent. Apply the same standard to all, or admit that your standard is a weapon, not a measure. Axis 7. The moral psychology of fairness as symmetry. Moral psychology distinguishes between equality, treating everyone the same, and equity, adjusting treatment based on perceived need or desert. The ideology deliberately conflates the two, using the moral weight of fairness to smuggle in a redistributive agenda that no one would accept if stated honestly. We known as SA performs this equivocation in slow motion. She begins with fairness. The answer is always together. She ends with extraction. The surplus never was yours. The journey from together to theft is paved with the slippery stone of equity, a word that sounds like justice but means redistribution based on grievance. The syllogism runs like this. Premise 1. Fairness requires that everyone's contribution be recognized. Premise 2. The mother's emotional labor has been historically unrecognized. Premise 3, therefore, the father's financial surplus must be taxed to compensate her. Hidden premise, the father's labor is not emotional, not sacrificial, and not worthy of the same recognition. Conclusion, the father owes, period. But the hidden premise is false. The father's labor is emotional. Ask any man who has worked a job he hated to feed children he loves. The father's labor is sacrificial. Ask any man who has gone without so his family could have. The father's labor is unrecognized. Ask any man who has been treated as an ATM by a family court system that calls his presence optional and his wallet mandatory. The ideology cannot see this because its epistemology forbids seeing it. Feminist standpoint epistemology holds that lived experience overrides data, but only certain lived experiences count. The father's lived experience of exhaustion, sacrifice, and silent service is invisible by doctrinal fiat. The mother's lived experience of emotional labor is infallible by doctrinal decree. This is not fairness. This is a rigged casino where the house always wins and the dealer calls it justice. Androcentric decode. They want the benefits of the old order, provision, protection, stability, without the costs, duty, loyalty, submission to a shared standard. They want the father's money without the father's authority. They want the harvest without the plowman. Counter logos. Justice is giving each their due, not taking from one to give to another. Equality of dignity is not sameness of office. Fairness is not symmetry of outcome. Axis 8, the postmodern fallacy of language games. Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, and their descendants argued that language does not describe reality. It constitutes it. Change the words, and you change the world. This is the epistemological foundation of the ideology's rhetorical strategy. Winona's essay is a language game masterclass. Taxation becomes restorative justice. Discipline becomes trauma. Provision becomes colonial extraction. Competence becomes unearned privilege. Dependency becomes authenticity. Authority becomes violence. The father becomes the hegemonic narrative. Each renaming is an act of conquest. By changing the word, the ideology changes the moral valence without changing the material reality. The tax still extracts, the discipline still forms, the provision still feeds. But the new names make resistance feel immoral. If you oppose restorative justice, you oppose justice. If you defend discipline, you defend trauma. The language traps the mind before the policy traps the body. But reality answers back. The bill comes due regardless of the name on the check. The child still needs a father, regardless of what the committee calls him. The bridge still needs an engineer, regardless of what the curriculum calls merit. The harvest still needs a plowman, regardless of what the seminar calls provision. The postmodern language game is a spell, and like all spells, it breaks when the enchanted person speaks the true name of the thing before him. Androcentric decode. They are playing word games to hide the material reality of their dependency. Name the thing, say tax, say extraction, say theft. Watch the spell shatter. Counter logos. A is A. Changing the name does not change the nature. Reality has the last word, and reality does not read critical theory. The trait and attribution map. Let us consolidate the personality dynamics and attribution patterns into a diagnostic grid, as a physician would present a case file. The ideological posture exhibits the following profile. Low conscientiousness, moralized, reframed as resistance to oppressive standards. The activist cannot meet the bar, so she declares the bar oppressive. The father who meets the bar is declared privileged for having done what she could not. This is not analysis, it is rationalization dressed in academic robes. High neuroticism, weaponized, reframed as sensitivity to structural harm, the activist's emotional reactivity, the inability to tolerate disagreement, discomfort, or judgment is recast as moral insight. The more fragile the activist, the more authoritative her lived experience. Fragility becomes epistemology. Anxious, preoccupied attachment, legislated, reframed as demand for restorative justice. The activist's inability to self-soothe, to tolerate separation, or to accept limits becomes a political program. The state is enlisted as the eternal mother who never says no. The father is enlisted as the wallet that funds the nursery. External locus of control institutionalized, reframed as structural analysis. Every failure is someone else's fault. Every shortfall is the system's doing. The activist is never the author of her own misery. She is always the protagonist of someone else's crime. Fundamental attribution error systematized. The competent man's success is attributed to systemic forces, privilege, scaffolding, extraction. The dependent's failure is attributed to systemic forces, oppression, marginalization, erasure. Individual agency is erased entirely except for the activists whose agency is infallible. This profile, taken together, describes a person who is psychologically unsuited for liberty, and who therefore demands a political system that will manage her life for her, while punishing the people who are suited for liberty for the crime of being competent. The diagnostic question is not, what ideology does this person hold? The diagnostic question is, what psychological needs does this ideology serve? And the answer is clear. It serves the need to avoid judgment, evade responsibility, and extract resources from the competent while feeling morally superior about doing so. This is not a political position. This is a personality disorder with a press office. The fallacy stacked. Let us now dissect the formal logical errors, stacked like a tower of crooked bricks, each one load-bearing and none of them straight. Equivocation, justice, redistribution. Winona uses justice to mean taking from the competent to give to the dependent. But justice, classically defined, is rendering to each what is due. The father is due the fruits of his labor. The dependent is due the opportunity to earn and the correction that comes when she does not. Confusing justice with redistribution is not a mistake. It is a heist conducted inside a definition. Strawman, fatherhood equals oppression. Winona describes fatherhood as extraction disguised as love. But fatherhood in its actual form, not the caricature, is the sacrifice of male autonomy, energy, time, and resources for the formation of the next generation. To call this extraction is to call a foundation a burden, because it holds the house up. Appeal to emotion, lived experience greater than data. Winona demands that Riker submit to her lived experience as ultimate truth. But lived experience, untethered from data, is merely feeling. And feeling, as every father who has raised a teenager knows, is not always a reliable guide to reality. Ad hominem techno-nostalgia, Winona dismisses Riker's argument by labeling his person rather than engaging his claims. Techno-nostalgia is not a refutation, it is a sneer. The argument stands regardless of the emotional tone of the man who makes it. Begging the question, trauma justifies payment. Winona assumes the existence of patriarchal trauma to justify the taxation that is supposed to remedy it. But the trauma has not been demonstrated, it has been asserted. The conclusion, tax the father, is smuggled into the premise. The father is guilty. Circular reasoning at its finest, like a snake eating its own tail and calling it nutrition. False dilemma, tradition versus liberation. Winona frames the choice as either patriarchal oppression or liberatory equity. But there are other options, including the one the West actually built, complementary sex roles ordered toward the common good, with authority tied to duty and liberty bounded by law. Slippery slope, fluidity leads to collapse. The policy's logic does not stop at taxing fathers. If competence is unearned privilege, then all earned success is suspect. If authority is violence, then all authority is illegitimate. The trajectory leads to the abolition of every structure that makes civilization possible, not by accident, but by the internal logic of the ideology itself. Post hoc ergo propter hoc, Winona implies that the decline of traditional family structures caused women's liberation, as if no woman was ever oppressed by a bad husband, a bad law, or a bad culture. But the ideology commits the reverse error. It implies that all women's suffering was caused by patriarchy, as if no woman was ever protected, provided for, or formed by a good father, husband, or son. Appeal to authority, tenure greater the truth. Winona's credentials, PhD, Director, Institute, Oberlin Press, are presented as evidence that her claims are true. But credentials certify compliance with a disciplinary regime, not correspondence with reality. A PhD in a captured field is a receipt for ideological conformity, not a license to redefine nature. Red herring, gaming history versus family policy. Winona shifts the argument from the actual policy taxing fathers to Riker's metaphorical use of 16-bit gaming. The gaming metaphor is illustrative, not definitive. Attacking the metaphor does not answer the argument. Moving the goalposts, standards are arbitrary. When Riker cites a standard, Winona calls the standard historically specific. When Riker cites a different standard, she calls it hegemonic. There is no standard she would accept, because acceptance would require self-judgment. And self-judgment is the one thing the ideology is designed to prevent. No, true Scotsmen, real fathers provide. You don't. Winona redefines father to exclude every father who exercises authority, enforces discipline, or expects his provision to come with the authority that provision naturally generates. The real father in her catechism is a participant, a word that means one who shares in without specifying what is shared, or who decides the terms. This is fatherhood with the father removed, a circumcised patriarchy, bleeding but still paying. The satanic inversion. The ideological operation at the heart of the Bayreuth budget is what the classical and Christian tradition would call a demonic inversion, not because any individual person is possessed, but because the structure of the argument inverts the moral order in a pattern that recurs across history, literature, and theology. The pattern is simple and ancient. Good is called evil. The Father's provision is called extraction. His discipline is called trauma. His authority is called violence. His competence is called privilege. His sacrifice is called control. Evil is called good. Dependency is called authenticity. Lack of discipline is called liberation. Emotional reactivity is called lived experience. Resentment is called justice. The demand for unearned resources is called restorative. This is not merely a disagreement about policy, it is a metaphysical rebellion, a refusal to accept the world as it is, and a determination to rebuild it according to the blueprints of appetite. The word satanic comes from Hebrew Satan, the adversary, the accuser. The satanic inversion does not create, it accuses. It stands before the good, points at it, and says, "This is evil." It stands before evil, points at it, and says, "This is good." It does not build an alternative. It inverts the existing order and calls the wreckage liberation. The rainbow inversion is the clearest signal. In Genesis, the rainbow appears after the flood as a covenant sign. God's promise that judgment will be restrained, that the waters of chaos will not again consume the earth. The rainbow is a limit on destruction, a boundary between divine wrath and divine mercy. When the ideology captures the rainbow, it inverts every element. The covenant becomes a demand, not for restraint, but for unlimited appetite. The promise becomes a license, not to be preserved, but to dissolve every boundary. The restraint becomes oppression. The hard lines of sex, duty, office, and nature are recast as violence against fluidity. The rainbow, once aimed at heaven, is turned sideways. It no longer signifies the end of the flood. It signifies the flood itself, the rising waters of appetite, bureaucracy, and grievance, drowning the structures that held civilization above the waterline. This is not symbolism for its own sake. This is the theological grammar of the ideology's deepest logic. It does not merely disagree with the old order, it desecrates it. It takes the sacred signs of restraint, covenant, and natural law and turns them into banners of liberation from all restraint, all covenant, and all nature. The satanic inversion is always self-refuting. If competence is privilege, then the ideology's own advocates, tenured, funded, empowered, are the most privileged of all. If authority is violence, then the committee's authority to tax is the greatest violence in the room. If language constitutes reality, then Winona's own language is nothing but a power play, and her claims to care are just another move in the game. The ideology cannot survive its own premises. It is a snake that swallows itself and calls the digestion deconstruction. The matrix of sins. The classical and Christian tradition identifies 7 deadly sins, not because they are the only sins, but because they are the generative sins, the root dispositions that produce all the others. At their head stands pride, the refusal to receive created order, limits, sexed nature, hierarchy, duty, and truth as gifts rather than raw material for self-invention. Let us map the sins onto the Beowulf budget and Winona's essay with the precision of a forensic accountant auditing a corrupt firm. Pride, superbia, the chief deadly sin. Pride is the engine. It is the refusal to accept that the world has a grammar you did not write. The committee believes it can redesign the family without reference to natural law, history, biology, or theology. It believes a 4-to-1 vote can override the sexed body, the child's need for a father, and the man's right to the fruits of his labor. Pride says, "I will not serve, I will define." It is the sin of the angel who refused his station, not because his station was bad, but because it was given. The committee refuses the given. It insists on legislating the real. It treats nature as a draft and the committee room as the editorial office. Winona's essay radiates pride. She writes as though the tradition of fatherhood built by millions of men across millennia, tested by war, famine, poverty, and time, is a text that her seminar can deconstruct. She treats the cathedral as a rough draft and her pen as the red ink. She does not build, she edits. And what she edits out is the load-bearing wall. Diagnostic. Pride is present wherever reality is treated as negotiable and the self is treated as sovereign. The cure is humility, the willingness to receive the world as a gift, to accept limits as mercy, and to serve an order you did not create. Envy, invidia. Envy is the pain at another's good. It is not the desire to have what the other has. It is the desire to destroy what the other has, so that the pain of comparison ceases. The committee's resentment of the father's competence is textbook envy. His stability, his earnings, his authority, his discipline, these are not seen as goods to be imitated, but as offenses to be punished. The surplus is not a reward for virtue, it is a crime that demands restitution. Envy does not build, it levels. It cannot raise the envious person up, so it drags the envied person down. The committee does not help the dependent become competent. It makes the competent person poorer and calls the result equity. Winona's essay is a cathedral of envy. Every sentence is a chisel stroke aimed at the statue of the father. She cannot build a better father, so she must destroy the image of the good father and replace it with the image of the oppressor. Riker is not a man who earned what he has. He is a thief. His earnings are stolen goods. His provision is colonial extraction. His discipline is binding. Envy always speaks in the language of justice. It always claims to be restoring balance. But its fruit is always the same. The competent are punished, the dependent are flattered, and the gap between them widens, because the one was demoralized and the other was never trained. Diagnostic, envy is present wherever excellence is called oppression and failure is called authenticity. The cure is admiration, the willingness to look at the competent person and say, "Teach me." Wrath, ira. Wrath is the activist rage dressed as compassion. It is the fury that burns behind the committee's care. It is the desire to punish, not to correct, not to restore, but to make the competent suffer for being competent. Winona's essay crackles with it. The word extraction is a weapon. The phrase colonial extraction from the domestic sphere is a grenade, thrown into the living room of every household where a man works to feed his family. The comparison of fatherhood to colonialism, a system of violent conquest and exploitation, is not analysis. It is calumny. It is the deliberate defamation of every good father who has ever sacrificed for his children. Wrath does not build, it burns. And what it burns is the trust between men and women, fathers and children, citizens and institutions. Diagnostic, wrath is present wherever justice means making them pay. The cure is forgiveness, the willingness to let go of the grievance and build something new. Sloth and acedia. Sloth is not merely laziness, it is the refusal of the hard yoke of duty. Acedia is its spiritual form, the noonday demon that whispers, "Why bother? It doesn't matter. Nothing is worth the effort." The committee's policy is sloth legislated. It says to the dependent, "You do not need to train. You do not need to discipline yourself. You do not need to climb the ladder. The ladder is oppressive. Sit. We will tax someone else and bring you the fruit." Winona's essay is acidly theologized. She calls effort trauma. She calls discipline binding. She calls the standard a battle standard. She transforms the refusal to grow into a moral position. Not trying becomes resistance. Not working becomes authenticity. Not building becomes fluidity. This is the sin that kills civilizations, not with a bang, but with a sigh. The bridges do not collapse because of an earthquake. They collapse because no one maintained them. The children do not fail because of a crisis. They fail because no one formed them. The standard does not fall because of an assault. It falls because no one climbed it. Diagnostic, sloth is present wherever correction is called cruelty and preparation is called trauma. The cure is diligence, the willing embrace of the hard task that produces strength. Lust and gluttony, luxuria, gula. Lust is the sovereignty of appetite over virtue. Gluttony is appetite without restraint. In the ideological register, these sins appear as liberation scripts, the celebration of impulse, the dissolution of boundary, the glorification of the unrestrained self. The committee's invocation of fluid identity is lust and gluttony moralized. It says, your appetite is your truth, your desire is your identity, your impulse is your authority. The rainbow, once a sign of restraint, becomes a banner of unlimited appetite, not just sexual, but ontological. You can be anything, you can change, you can dissolve. And anyone who says otherwise is committing violence against your full, fluid, unbounded humanity. But a humanity without bounds is not free, it is dissolving. A self without form is not authentic, it is formless. And formlessness is not liberation, it is the abyss. Diagnostic, lust and gluttony are present wherever appetite is called identity and restraint is called oppression. The cure is temperance, the mastery of desire by reason and virtue. Avarice, avaritia. Avarice is the desire for what is not yours. It is the sin of the person who looks at another's goods and says, that should be mine. The committee's policy is avarice institutionalized. It looks at the father's earnings and says, this surplus was never yours. It looks at his labor and says, this was always together. It looks at his provision and says, this is owed to us. We known as essay is avarice philosophized. She constructs an entire epistemology to justify the transfer of wealth from the competent to the dependent, from the man who earned it to the committee that wants it. She calls the transfer restorative justice. She calls the earnings unearned. She calls the extraction care. But avarice does not become generosity by changing its name. Theft does not become charity by passing through a committee. The father's wallet is not a commons because the committee declares it so. Diagnostic. Avarice is present wherever justice means giving me your money. The cure is generosity, the voluntary gift of one's own goods, not the coerced transfer of another's. Vainglory, vanagloria. Vainglory is the desire for the appearance of virtue without the substance. It is the performance of goodness for an audience. We known as essay is vainglory perfected. Every sentence is staged. Every paragraph performs care. The essay is not written to help anyone, it is written to be seen helping. Its purpose is not to feed the hungry or form the child. Its purpose is to display the author's moral purity, to signal her virtue to the readers of Oberford Press and the attendees of the next conference. The committee meeting is the same, a performance of equity whose outcome is extraction. The language is polished, the mood is solemn, the vote is recorded, and the competent man walks out poorer. The dependent walks out unchanged, and the committee members walk out with the grant application. Diagnostic. Vainglory is present wherever virtue is performed for an audience, and the audience pays the bill. The cure is humility, the willingness to do good without applause, and to accept correction without defending one's image. Despair, desperatio. Despair is the will to pull the whole world down, because the soul refuses repair. It is the sin that says, the old order is irredeemably broken. Burn it, build nothing, let the ashes be the new Jerusalem. Why known as essay ends on a note that is either triumphant or despairing. You cannot tell, because in the ideology, the two are indistinguishable. She writes of the end of the old order of flood, as if the flood were the problem, not the solution to a world that had dissolved into violence. She writes of a world with no thrones, as if the absence of authority were freedom rather than chaos. She writes of full, fluid, unbounded humanity, as if humanity without bounds were a person rather than a puddle. This is despair dressed as hope. It is the celebration of the void. It is the smile on the face of the drowning man who has decided that water is his natural element. Diagnostic. Despair is present wherever destruction is called liberation, and nothing is built to replace what was torn down. The cure is hope, the theological virtue that trusts in a good that exceeds our present capacity to see, and that works patiently, faithfully, through discipline and sacrifice to build that good in time. The androcentric counter-logos. Having diagnosed the disease, let us now write the prescription. The ideology's power rests on a single bluff, the claim that its compassion is real and your standards are cruel. The counter-move is simple, devastating, and ancient. Tell the truth. Standard 1. Fatherhood is not oppression. Fatherhood is the office through which a man names the world for his children, protects them from its dangers, forms them in virtue, provides for their needs, and transmits the inheritance of civilization across the chasm of death. This is not extraction, this is gift. The word father comes from Latin pater, a word linked to protector, provider, preserver. To call this office oppressive is to call the foundation of the house a burden because it holds the roof up. Standard 2. Competence is not privilege. Competence is the fruit of discipline, sacrifice, delayed gratification, and repeated failure. To call it unearned is to spit on every man who ever got up at dawn, worked a job he hated, went without so his children could have, and kept his word when it cost him. Competence is not a gift from the system. It is a conquest of the self over appetite, fear, and inertia. It deserves honor, not taxation. Standard 3. Standards are not violence. Standards are ladders. They tell the young where to climb. They tell the weak what to train. They tell the institution what to protect. They tell the soul what is worth becoming. A world without standards is not free. It is flat, and a flat world has no peaks, no vistas, no ascent, and no meaning. Standard 4. Equality of dignity does not mean sameness of role. Men and women are equal in dignity. They are not identical in function. The ideology's demand that all roles be interchangeable is not justice. It is flatness enforced by force. The complementarity of the sexes, the mother's nurturing, the father's discipline, the union of tenderness and strength is not a patriarchal conspiracy. It is the grammar of the human family, written in the body, confirmed by millennia of practice, and vindicated by every study that shows children need both a mother and a father. Standard 5. Truth is not a power move. Winona claims that all knowledge is situated and all language is a power play. But if that is true, then her knowledge is situated and her language is a power play. The ideology eats itself. The only way out is to affirm what every sane civilization has affirmed, that truth is knowable, that reality answers back, and that the man who honors the truth will prosper while the man who denies it will fall, regardless of what the committee votes. Standard 6. Compassion without correction is sabotage. Real compassion does not say, "You are perfect as you are." It says, "You are not perfect, and that is okay, because there is a ladder, and I will help you climb it." Real compassion does not lower the standard. It strengthens the climber. It does not abolish the test. It prepares the student. Standard 7. Beauty is not oppression. Beauty is order made visible. The ideology attacks beauty because beauty witnesses against it. A beautiful building, a beautiful body, a beautiful family, a beautiful life. These things testify that order is possible, that discipline works, that nature has a form worth honoring. The ideology must call beauty exclusionary because beauty excludes the formless, the undisciplined, and the chaotic. But that exclusion is not cruelty, it is testimony. Beauty is reality's sermon, preached in stone and flesh and light, and the ideology cannot silence it. So it must uglify everything and call the ugliness authenticity. Standard 8. The father's authority is tied to his duty and cannot be severed without injustice. You cannot demand that a man provide while stripping him of the authority to direct what he provides for. You cannot demand that a man sacrifice his labor, his time, his body, and his life for a household while declaring his governance of that household oppressive. Authority without duty is tyranny. But duty without authority is slavery. The father's authority is not arbitrary. It is functional. It exists because the household needs a head, the children need a former, and the wife needs a partner whose commitment is structural, not emotional. The counter-syllogism: let us seal the case with formal logic. As the scholastics did. Major premise: justice requires that authority and liability be joined. No person may be held liable for what they do not have authority to direct. Minor premise: the committee's policy holds the father liable for provision, financial responsibility, while stripping him of authority, paternal governance. Conclusion: the committee's policy is unjust. Major premise: a standard that cannot be met is not a standard, it is a weapon. Minor premise: the ideology's standard, no one's humanity contingent on conformity to any standard, is a standard that abolishes all standards, including its own. Conclusion: the ideology is self-refuting. Major premise: a civilization that cannot distinguish between better and worse cannot transmit the knowledge required for its own survival. Minor premise: the ideology abolishes the distinction between better and worse, calling excellence privilege and failure authenticity. Conclusion: the ideology is civilizational suicide. The final maxim set. Standards are ladders. Resentment calls them walls. Lowering the measure does not lift the person. Equity grading is fraud committed against the future. Beauty is not oppression. Beauty is order made visible. Compassion without correction is disguised contempt. A civilization that cannot say better and worse cannot survive. The war on standards is the war on reality's right to answer back. Excellence is not cruelty. Excellence is love with a spine. Nature is not bigotry. Difference is not hatred. Hierarchy is not oppression. Unjust hierarchy is duty without authority is servitude. Authority without sacrifice is tyranny. The family is civilization in seed. Kill the father, and the state becomes the father, and the state is a father who eats his children. The restoration. What is to be done, not rage, not revenge, not the mirror image ideology that calls all women evil and all tradition pure. What is to be done is what men have always done when the floods came. Build. Build households where fathers are present, strong, loving, and disciplined. Build schools where children learn grammar, logic, rhetoric, history, scripture, craft, and the canon of the West. Build churches where the Logos is preached without apology, and the father's role is honored without irony. Build guilds where young men learn trades from older men who take pride in their work. Build friendships where men hold each other accountable to virtue. Build laws that protect due process, equal standing, and the rights of fathers. Build beauty in homes, in worship, in speech, in the body, in the city. The ideology is powerful, but it is parasitic. It cannot build. It can only capture what others have built and extract from what others have earned. Its power lasts only as long as the competence it demonizes continues to feed it. So stop feeding it. Build outside the committee. Build beyond the institution. Build in the soil where the old roots still run deep in the household, the parish, the workshop, the courtroom, the library, the playground, where a father teaches his son to throw a ball and his daughter to stand up straight. The Logos is not a hegemonic narrative. It is the grammar of reality. It was here before the committee. It will be here after the committee's minutes are filed in the basement of a building no one remembers the name of. Reality answers back. And reality does not negotiate with committees. Access Ledger. The practical access ledger for men. A field manual for demonic diagnosis and Logos restoration. The Adlerian will to power inequality language. Symptom. She demands you submit to her lived experience as supreme tribunal, while dismissing your empirical evidence as hegemonic narrative control. Her feelings are verdicts, your facts are violence. Hidden payoff, unearned authority without the burden of competence. She ascends to judge over you while claiming she is being liberated. Her equality is your color. Fallacy, appeal to emotion compounded with ad hominem. Your argument is dismissed because of who you are, male, competent, historically literate, not what you demonstrate. Counter Logos. Equality is not the abolition of hierarchy. Equality is the fair application of one standard to all souls. A scale that moves for feelings is not justice. It is a rigged casino calling itself a courthouse. The Logos does not consult your self-esteem before answering. Puncturing question. If lived experience is the supreme measure of truth, why does my lived experience of your dishonesty count for nothing? The Jungian shadow of the father. Symptom. The committee calls paternal discipline, oppression, and paternal provision control. Everything the father does is recoded as aggression. His restraint becomes toxic silence. His generosity becomes financial coercion. His absence becomes the proof of his guilt. His presence becomes the proof of his dominance. He is guilty by existing. Hidden payoff. The incompetent avoid the mirror. Your competence exposes their failure, so they must smash the mirror and call the shards justice. If the standard is the enemy, no one has to climb. Fallacy. Projection wrapped in straw man. They are not refuting fatherhood. They are refuting a cartoon of fatherhood they constructed to avoid confronting their own indiscipline. Counter Logos. The father is not the shadow. He is the light that reveals the shadow. To call the lamp darkness, because it shows the dirt, is the oldest lie, non serviam dressed in policy language. The sun is not guilty for what it illuminates. Puncturing question. If my competence is the problem, what exactly does your incompetence entitle you to? The Freudian reaction formation against dependency. Symptom. She insists she needs no man, needs no provision, needs no authority above her, while simultaneously demanding your surplus earnings be taxed to subsidize her emotional labor. She declares independence with one hand and writes the invoice with the other. The rhetoric is autonomy, the ledger is parasitism. Hidden payoff, total freedom from obligation matched with total claim on provision. She wants the old order's material benefits without the old order's moral costs. She wants the crown without the cross. She wants the harvest without the planting. She wants you dissolved into a line item. Fallacy, performative contradiction. The claim, I am self-sufficient, is refuted by the demand, pay me for existing. The speech act destroys itself in the speaking. She is the landlord who denies the house exists while collecting the rent. Counter-logos. Authority and duty are a matched pair. Strip a man of command and you strip him of liability, or you have invented slavery with progressive branding. A father who must provide without authority is not a partner. He is a beast of burden with a nicer stall. The old word for this was servitude. The new word is equity. Puncturing question. If you truly need nothing from me, why does your entire policy agenda end at my wallet? IV. The attribution exure of structural guilt. Symptom. Your success is unearned privilege. Her policy failure is structural wisdom. When you build, you stole. When she fails, she was robbed. Every outcome she dislikes is evidence of systemic crime. Every outcome she prefers is justice. The data changes, the verdict never does. You are guilty before the evidence and guilty after it. Hidden payoff. Immunity from accountability forever. If the system is always guilty, the individual is never responsible. If failure is always caused by invisible forces, no one ever has to improve, repent, or stop. It is a get-out-of-conscience-free card. Unlimited prints. Fallacy, fundamental attribution error fused with double standard identical actions receive opposite moral verdicts based on identity category. This is not analysis. It is a kangaroo court with academic citations. Counter-logos. Judge the act, not the identity. Judge the result, not the intent. The man who built the house is not the thief. The committee that seized it is. Equum est eius. What is equal is just. Collective guilt is not justice. It is lynch mob logic with peer review. If guilt is inherited, then so is virtue, and the West's inheritance dwarfs its accusers' resentments. Puncturing question. Can you name one outcome anywhere that you would attribute to personal failure rather than structural injustice? If not, your theory is unfalsifiable and therefore not knowledge, but religion. V. The moral physiology of fairness as symmetry. Symptom. The committee calls taxation of the competent to subsidize the undisciplined restorative justice. They conflate equality, equal application of one rule, with equity, equal outcomes engineered by unequal rules. The word justice is stolen, gutted, and worn as a skin suit by redistribution. Hidden payoff. They collect the prestige of fairness while practicing discrimination. They get the moral high ground without climbing it. They wear justice's clothes while pickpocketing its treasury. The virtuous language camouflages the avaricious machinery. Fallacy, equivocation, justice slides between giving each their due classical and taking from the capable to give to the favored ideological. Same word, opposite meaning. This is the serpent's oldest grammar trick. Thou shalt not surely die. Counter-logos, justice is giving each their due, not taking from one to give to another. The father who earns and provides fulfills justice. The committee that seizes and redistributes violates it. If you want the father's surplus, earn the father's virtue. Lowering the measure does not lift the person. It merely declares the ceiling illegal and calls the rubble a renovation. Puncturing question. If justice means equal outcomes, why should anyone exert effort? And if effort matters, why punish its results? VI. The postmodern fallacy of languish games. Symptom. They rename taxation restorative justice, discipline, oppression, competence, privilege, fatherhood, control, and appetite, authenticity. They believe truly, religiously believe, that changing the name changes the reality. The rainbow becomes fluid identity. The covenant becomes a color wheel. The word is the world. The dictionary is the decree. Hidden payoff: power over reality without the trouble of mastering it. If language constructs truth, then controlling language is controlling truth. And whoever captures the HR department captures creation itself. No need to build, earn, or prove. Just redefine. Fallacy: nominalism fused with linguistic determinism, the claim that words precede and constitute reality rather than describe it. This is not philosophy. It is a magic spell believed by people too sophisticated to believe in magic, but too vain to submit to reality. Counter logos: reality answers back. The bill comes due regardless of the name on the check. Gravity does not read your pronouns. The budget does not care about your narrative. The child needs a father, not a co-parenting stakeholder. You can rename the flood aquatic inclusion, your house still drowns. Veritas vos liberabit, but only if you stop lying first. Puncturing question: if words create reality, why can't you define your way out of needing my money? Master ledger maxim: the ideology is one machine with 6 gears. It fears your competence shadow, covets your resources reaction, recodes your virtue as theft attribution, steals the language of justice to legitimize the heist symmetry, disguises domination as liberation, will to power, and renames the rubble as renovation language games. 6 gears, 1 engine, 1 fuel resentment, 1 brake, the logos reality named honestly, defended without apology. Stand, speak. Refuse the renamed slavery. The measuring stick is yours to restore. Schema, axes. The Adlerian will to power in equality language. Adlerian signal. Vance's demand that Riker submit to her lived experience as the ultimate truth, despite his empirical data on gaming history. Counter logos. Equality is not the abolition of hierarchy, but the fair application of standards to all. The Jungian shadow of the father. Jungian signal. The characterization of the father's discipline as oppression and his provision as control. Counter logos. The father is not the shadow. He is the light that reveals the shadow. The Freudian reaction formation. Freudian signal. The emphasis on emotional labor as a taxable commodity, turning the mother's affection into a transaction. Counter logos. True love is disciplined. It says no to build character, not yes to validate appetite. The Big Five low conscientiousness moralized, trait model, signal. The rejection of the 16-bit standard of excellence in favor of fluid and inclusive mediocrity. Counter logos. Standards are not walls, they are the walls that keep the storm out. The attachment anxious preoccupied inversion. Attachment, signal. The demand for tax subsidies as compensation for the trauma of patriarchy. Counter logos. Security comes from structure, not from endless accommodation. The attribution error of structural guilt. Attribution, signal. Riker's success is unearned privilege. Vance's policy success is structural wisdom. Counter logos. Judge the act, not the identity. Judge the result, not the intent. The moral psychology of fairness as symmetry. Moral psychology, signal. The tax on the earner to subsidize the non-earner framed as justice. Counter logos. Justice is giving each their due, not taking from one to give to another. The postmodern fallacy of language games. Fallacy, signal. Calling taxation, restorative justice, and discipline oppression. Counter logos. Reality answers back. The bill comes due regardless of the name on the check. I want you to walk away with one rule, forged in the same fire that tempered every cartridge I ever snapped into a slot. When someone comes to you draped in the language of compassion, demanding you lower a standard, rename a virtue, or surrender an authority, run their claim through 3 gates. First, the gate of incentives. Who gets paid, who gets power, who gets excused from the table if this proposal becomes law? Trace the money, trace the status, trace the escape hatch. The committee that taxes competence to subsidize appetite is not compassionate. It is a parasite with a press release. Second, the gate of projection, whatever sin they scream loudest about, is the sin they are committing. The activist who calls fatherhood oppression is exercising tyrannical power over the family while pretending to liberate it. The academic who calls your data violence is wielding rhetoric as a weapon to avoid answering it. They project because confession would end their careers. Third, the gate of reality. Does the claim survive contact with the world? Does the renamed standard produce stronger children, safer streets, more beautiful art, more functional families, more honest men? If the answer is no, you are not looking at progress. You are looking at ruins with a fresh coat of paint. I learned this from games that did not care about my feelings. The boss did not lower its health because I felt inadequate. The level did not regrade itself because I refused to learn the pattern. The save file did not lie. The 16-bit era was the last culture that loved you enough to tell you the truth. You are not ready yet. And that is not cruelty. That is the first word of every real education. Every standard they dismantle is a level they are stealing from the next generation of players. Every excellence they call elitism is a high score they want erased from the record because they refuse to pick up the controller. The measuring stick is not their enemy. The measuring stick is the ladder they are too proud to climb. So when the language softens and the standards collapse and the compassionate faces gather around the table to vote away your authority while keeping your invoice, remember, compassion without correction is contempt wearing a halo. Reality always answers back. The only question is whether you will still be standing when it does. Sponsored book. 16-bit fun. It's all you need. I held that gray plastic controller in my hands, feeling its solid weight as the synthesized melodies of Chrono Trigger filled the room. Those 16-bit tones weren't merely electronic sounds. They were the harmonies of a civilization at its peak. My formative years coincided with what future historians will recognize as the golden age of digital entertainment, an era when games demanded skill, patience, and intellect. I recall the satisfaction of finally defeating the Death Egg in Sonic the Hedgehog 2 after weeks of systematic improvement, the precise timing required, the pattern recognition, the sheer meritocratic justice of succeeding only when one truly mastered the mechanics. This wasn't mindless distraction. It was digital forge where character was tempered through failure, analysis, perseverance, and eventual triumph. The games of the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis era embodied objective excellence with clear hierarchies of achievement, a mirror of the natural order itself. Each successful playthrough confirmed a fundamental truth. Competence should be rewarded, effort should yield results, and excellence should be celebrated rather than apologized for. This book exists because those truths have been systematically erased from our digital landscape, replaced by egalitarian mediocrity that undermines masculine development and denies the competitive spirit that once defined Western civilization. The decline wasn't accidental but deliberate. I've watched over 3 decades as gaming transformed from a meritocratic arena of skill testing to an ideological tool for cultural subversion. Modern gaming environments actively punish excellence through participation rewards, remove meaningful challenges that might create unequal outcomes, and insert political propaganda where once stood pure gameplay mechanics. This transformation parallels broader cultural collapse, the replacement of objective truth with subjective feelings, of merit with identity, of competition with safe spaces. The sophisticated architecture of 16-bit systems reflected universal truths about masculine excellence, with their limitations forcing developers to prioritize gameplay mechanics and innovative design over cinematic pandering. Every pixel served a purpose. Every frame of animation conveyed meaning through necessity rather than excess. Modern hardware's near-infinite potential has paradoxically resulted in shallower experiences precisely because constraints no longer demand creative solutions. When technological capability expands while artistic integrity contracts, you're witnessing cultural regression, not progress. The 16-bit era represented the apex of Western gaming achievement precisely because it operated within Platonic ideals, maximizing excellence within defined constraints rather than drowning in infinite possibility without. Direction. Consider the philosophical foundations embedded in classic game design. In Final Fantasy VI, characters confront binary moral choices between good and evil, reflecting the Augustinian framework of ethical clarity rather than modern moral relativism. Super Metroid presents environments as moral architecture, each space designed to test different aspects of competence and decision-making, precisely the kind of controlled environment that Aristotle would recognize as cultivating virtue through practice. The console wars between Nintendo and Sega created a competitive marketplace where consumers rewarded technical superiority and gameplay innovation, a triumph of rational judgment over emotional manipulation. This book will systematically deconstruct how these games functioned as masculine rites of passage, their difficulty metrics serving as objective standards for character formation. The controlled environments of 16-bit games breed superior masculine virtue precisely because they present challenges that demand mastery rather than offering mere illusions of accomplishment. When you finally defeated Mother Brain or Sephiroth, you weren't given a participation trophy, you earned victory through demonstrable competence. Understanding that the universe responds to merit rather than entitlement, this text is written for men who recognize that something fundamental has been lost. You sense the disconnection from a time when entertainment embodied objective excellence and clear hierarchies of achievement. You feel the wrongness of modern systems that undermine masculine development through egalitarian mediocrity. You seek connection with the structured competition and meritocratic principles that once forged character in young men. Perhaps you remember Saturday mornings spent mastering Streets of Rage 2 or late nights conquering Mega Man X, and intuitively recognize that those experiences shaped your understanding of competence and achievement. You've watched with growing concern as gaming and broader culture succumb to the same ideological possession, a vast conspiracy of genocentric silence that restructures all human activity to accommodate feminine preferences, rather than objective excellence. This book will demonstrate through logical syllogism and historical evidence how 16-bit architecture reflects universal truths of masculine excellence that remain irrefutable despite relentless ideological attack. We will explore how ancient philosophical principles embedded in classic game design can be reclaimed to restore meaning through purposeful engagement with challenging systems. If you're comfortable with contemporary culture's celebration of mediocrity, if you believe that equality of outcome should supersede meritocratic principles, if you find the concept of binary moral judgments troubling, this book is not for you. Put it down immediately. Find a hobby that doesn't challenge your preconceptions or demand intellectual rigor. Perhaps a coloring book or guided meditation would better suit your temperament. There is no shame in acknowledging when a work exceeds your capacity for engagement or contradicts your fundamental beliefs about human nature. This text makes no apologies for its focus on masculine virtue, Western excellence, and the objective hierarchies that natural selection and human history both demonstrate to be inescapable. Those who find such perspectives problematic will experience only discomfort here, as we systematically dismantle the egalitarian fantasies that have replaced cultural confidence with apology and accommodation. Your time would be better spent with books that reinforce rather than challenge your worldview, as this work addresses those prepared to face uncomfortable truths about cultural decline and the masculine path to restoration. Within these pages, you will discover how 16-bit consoles functioned as digital parthenons representing the peak of Western digital architecture, embodying principles of form and function that modern developers have abandoned. We will examine the sound of civilization through the musical excellence of composers like Koji Kondo and Yuzo Koshiro, whose melodic mastery worked within technological constraints to create art that transcends mere entertainment. The text explores how level design functions as moral architecture, creating spaces of masculine testing that build character through systematic challenge and reward. You will learn about the NPC menace, how modern gaming became a tool of genocentric control through systematic removal of competitive elements and objective difficulty metrics. We will establish 16-bit games as Western cultural heritage, worthy of preservation and study, examining canon formation through the lens of objective excellence rather than ideological conformity. The book reveals the fatherhood principle as manifested through mentoring and lineage in classic games, showing how these narratives reflected and reinforced masculine developmental patterns. By understanding the cyclical nature of excellence and decline, you will gain perspective on our current cultural moment and how the 16-bit way offers a path toward reclaiming masculine excellence in the modern world. The insights herein extend far beyond nostalgic appreciation or game criticism. They provide a framework for understanding how excellence emerges from constraints, how virtue develops through systematic challenge, how masculine identity forms through competence demonstration and hierarchical achievement. This book offers actionable strategies for restoring meaning through purposeful engagement with challenging systems, principles applicable to gaming, career development, personal growth, and cultural participation. You will learn to recognize and resist the ideological possession that turns humans into NPCs, repeating programmed responses without critical thought. The text equips you with rhetorical tools and historical understanding to defend Western cultural achievements against those who would denigrate excellence as elitism or competence as privilege. Most importantly, you will reconnect with the masculine digital heritage that shaped an entire generation of men, the competitive spirit, the problem-solving mindset, the resilience forged through repeated failure leading to eventual mastery. The 16-bit era was not merely a period in gaming history, it represented the final flowering of Western gaming achievement before cultural decline began its systematic dismantling of meritocratic principles. By reclaiming these games and their underlying philosophy, you reclaim part of what made the West great: unapologetic excellence, hierarchical recognition, and the understanding that achievement follows competence rather than entitlement. 16-bit fun. It's all you need. Written by Conrad Reicher. Buy now. Links in description.